This content is a review of some of the concepts we covered last 2 weeks on measurement, the dependent variable, extraneous variables, independent variables, and conditions. And we're going to frame all of this in the context of reading research papers. Okay, so first off, in order to read a research article, you have to understand its anatomy. It has a structure, particularly in the APA style. So first thing is it has a title and abstract, which are really important. And you can see here the title is on the top, which gives you a lot of information we'll look at on the next slide. And then the abstract gives you this deep view. You can see this is trying to show a three-dimensional picture. So it's like a deep view, but a very brief summary of the whole thing. Then we come to the introduction, which starts out pretty broad and then narrows us down to understanding what the study is going to be. Then we come to the literature review, which reviews scientific findings about this, the method, how they're going to study their next question, and the results and discussion. It ends with a conclusion, and the conclusion isn't just a summary of the results, it links back to all these other findings and why these results are important. And then, of course, the all-important references at the end, because in science, we're always building on previous science. So let's look at each of these pieces individually. We start with the title and abstract. So you might think this is like nothing, but it's actually so important. And when you start looking for articles yourself, you'll find that this is the beginning point that tells you if you want to bother to read the whole article. So just like you would not go to see a movie without probably reading the title of the movie, then you would go on and maybe read a description of the movie and maybe watch a trailer. And then you'd be able to decide if the movie's one that would appeal to you. And that's what the title and abstract do for you when you're reading research. So a title is going to be really direct, descriptive, kind of long. It'll be really accurate, not misleading. It's not trying to tease you in. It's just trying to be clear and tell you exactly what the study is. So it's going to be long, but hopefully not more than 12 words. We'll look at we're just going to look at a couple examples here, but we'll keep looking at examples in our class. And so then if you find the title is relevant, then you go on and read the abstract, which tells you a little bit more about it, just like in deciding whether to watch a movie. So an abstract is just a simple, specific, clear, unbiased, honest, concise, precise, standalone, complete, scholarly, structured paragraph of just 150 to 250 words, really short. And in it, you can find the rationale, hypothesis, the study, the findings, and the implications. So it'll give you a lot. Here's just one example. This was mentioned in the Jordan article that you've read by now, and the title is Sad and Guilty: Affective Influences on the Explanation of Conflict in Close Relationships. And if we parse this out, we can see that sad and guilty are emotions or are affective factors. So by affect, we mean emotion linked to something, the affect, how we feel about something. So now this title is Affective Influences. So how does the way you're feeling about something influence, and now influence the explanation of conflict? So how does the way you're feeling about something affect how you explain conflicts in your relationships? So if you're feeling sad and guilty, do you explain this fight you had with your spouse or partner differently than if you're not feeling sad and guilty? And so even if the article seems relevant, you read the title and abstract, remember you need to read the whole thing to understand the study. Just like you couldn't really understand the whole movie from just the preview, similarly, you can't understand the whole study from just the abstract. So here we continue to the study that we're going to be focusing on in this week's class. Young infants prefer prosocial to antisocial others. So this is even a shorter title. So we know we're working with young infants. That gives us a starting point. We know we're working with their preferences, and they are telling us the answer to their study, that the infants prefer people who are prosocial. meaning infants, meaning that the infants prefer people or characters that help others instead of hindering others. So we know a lot right from here. This seems interesting. How on earth do we know what young infants prefer? For that, you need to go back and look at the material I already presented, the habituation slides. So let's look at the abstract. Very short, you can see. The current study replicates and extends the finding, and then they interrupt our sentence right in the middle by telling us what finding. And so they're giving us, oh, it's this study. And so when you're first starting to read these articles, this will drive you batty. But once you get familiar with it, your eyes will be trained to just skip over the source until you need it. So it is important that they tell us the source, because you can never make stuff up when you're doing science. You can't just say, oh, infants like people who are nice. You have to provide a scientific foundation for that statement. And so that's what they're doing. They're saying, yep, there's a study that shows this, that infants prefer individuals who act pro-socially toward unrelated third parties over those who act antisocially. So they're replicating, meaning they're doing the same experiment, and they're extending the finding, taking us another step further. Now they continue to tell us what they did. Using different stimuli from those used by Hamlin et al. 2007. That's the study you just saw when you were looking at the video I shared with you. So they're using somewhat younger subjects and 2 additional social scenarios. So using that, they replicated the findings that infants prefer those who behave pro-socially versus antisocially, and that those preferences are in fact based on the social nature of their actions. The generality of infants' responses across multiple examples of pro-social and antisocial action supports the claim that social evaluation, in other words, how you judge situations around you, is fundamental to perceiving the world, even in infants. That's the really creative aspect of these experiments. So next we go on to the lit review. So you'll have an introduction, which is usually 1 paragraph, sometimes 2. And in that introduction, the researcher will establish the significance of the problem, why it's important, the gap in the existing literature, like the question that hasn't yet been answered, and the reason it's important to answer that question. You should see that in an introduction. And then you'll continue on to the lit review, but it may or may not have a separate heading. It might just continue on after that first paragraph, and it should lay out the entire research sequence that precedes this study. It should, if there's any big theory that they're working with, it should introduce the theory. And if there are any key terms they're going to be using, it should include those terms along with their definitions. And then it should end with restating what that question is that we call the gap, the research question, and the hypotheses. And so you'll remember, once again, I mentioned there's always going to be these citations or these parentheses in the middle of sentences telling you what the source of the information is. And so again, that can make it harder to get used to. So you really have to be diligent when you're reading. They try and be as brief as possible. What that means is that they choose their words really carefully, and they might say a lot with, say, just 1 sentence. So you can't skip forward. It's not like reading a novel. And then acronyms. An acronym is just an abbreviation. Like PTSD is an abbreviation or an acronym for post-traumatic stress disorder. And in this lit review and introduction, they're going to introduce those acronyms, but they'll only introduce them once. And so they might tell you, we're going to use the acronym helping characters, and we're going to use HC. And the first time they use HC, they'll tell you what it stands for. They'll write helping characters, and then in parentheses HC. After that, they're just going to use HC. So if you come to an acronym and you don't know what it is, you need to just go back to the beginning of the paper and look for the first time you see the acronym, which is where it will be defined. So here's the lit review in this paper we're reading. So I'll read segments of it. So this human tendency toward cooperation is present from very early in ontogeny. Now, this means like the development of the species, and in parallel, it means the development of the individual in gestation. And so if you come to a word like this and you don't know it, look it up. It'll be good for you. And then it talks about how early in the second year of life, toddlers do prosocial cooperative behaviors towards adults and peers. And then it says, for successful existence in our social world, we have to be able to distinguish those who may help us from those who may harm you. One way to determine how a potential social partner may treat you is through observing how he or she treats others. Recent research suggested that young infants can identify and discriminate prosocial and antisocial behaviors between third parties. 12-month-olds categorize social interactions in terms of their valence. Valence, in other words, you might not know, it just means importance. 9 and 12-month-olds expect one who is helped by one individual but hindered by another to behave differently toward the two individuals in future interactions. See how that's such a long sentence? You might have to go back and reread it. 9 and 12-month-olds expect that one who is helped by one individual but hindered by another will behave differently toward the two individuals. In other words, we're nicer to people who help us. And then we're still in the same sentence. And 6 and 10-month-old infants, so now we're really small babies. 6 and 10-month-old infants themselves approach those who have helped another and avoid those who have hindered another. And so then they go on to describe the study that you watched. The hill study, the helper who helped someone push up a hill and the hinderer who prevented them from going up the hill. And they describe that study that you watched in the video. And then they described what the study result was, that the infants responded differently depending on those characters' information, and that this preference for helpers over hinderers occurred even in 3 months of age. Very, very young babies. So now they're telling us why this is important. So now they said, in proposing that infants evaluate others based on their social behavior toward third parties. So they watch you and they watch how you treat others. That's what they're saying. These very young babies watch you and watch how you treat others, others being third parties. Continuing, it is important to demonstrate that infants' preference for those who behave pro-socially, helping others, versus anti-socially, applies across a range of social interactions and is not specific to one single social scenario, such as helping up a hill, or to a single kind of goal, such as moving from one place to another. So these researchers critiqued the study and they said, well, we want to make sure that it's not just these scenarios that caused infants to prefer the helpers. Adult humans evaluate others across countless social interactions that may include many kinds of goals. The present study addresses the generality of infant social preferences by asking whether infants in the first year of life evaluate those who behave pro-socially, helping, and anti-socially in 2 object-oriented goal scenarios, opening a box in experiment 1 and retrieving a dropped object in experiment 2. We're going to do experiment 1 in class, and you're going to analyze experiment 2 independently. So now we have the lit review, the next page, in which they're describing it to us the first experiment. It says, in the social condition, we can tell here that we're talking about an independent variable because we have conditions, so I expect we'll see another condition. Infants saw a plush animal hand puppet, and in parentheses they tell us that they're going to call this hand puppet the protagonist. And the protagonist is trying with difficulty to open the lid of a clear plastic box with a brightly colored rattle inside. You can picture the puppet trying to open the box. The protagonist was alternately aided by a pro-social puppet, the opener, who helped to open the box, and thwarted by an antisocial puppet, the closer, who slammed the box lid closed. Infants were then presented with the opener and closer characters and encouraged to reach for one of them. So we can picture what's happening here. The infants, just like you saw in the video, the infants are getting used to this situation and trying to determine whether they prefer the opener or the closer. But they were concerned about something. Let's read on. To ensure that infants' preferences were based on the social rather than the merely physical aspects of the character's behavior, a second group of infants saw a matched inanimate control condition. Here is our second condition. The control condition, in which instead of this brightly colored protagonist trying to open the box, we have an inanimate mechanical pincher perform the same physical actions on the box as the protagonist, with opener and closer puppets alternately enabling and blocking the opening of the box respectively, as in the social condition. Infants were then encouraged to reach for one of them. So now you get the two conditions. Much previous research has shown that an inanimate pincher or rod, acting upon an object in a manner similar to a human's or stuffed animal's hand, does not engage infants' intentional reasoning. Infants don't view such objects as social or intentional entities. Thus, in this inanimate control condition, the actions of opener and closer, while identical to those in the social condition, should not be seen by infants as facilitating or blocking the goal of an intentional agent. Neither event in this condition is a social interaction, so infants have no social reason to prefer one character over the other. So hopefully you grasped this. They gave us a whole list of research foundation for why they felt it was important to include this inanimate control condition. And that's because infants have been previously shown not to see mechanical objects as individuals acting intentionally as you or I would. So that was the literature review in which they described the experiment. Now let's look at the details. So a methods section in general describes the study that's conducted in sufficient detail that another person could replicate it and also understand anything that might have been unique in this implementation of the study. So they will tell us the participants, exactly who was in the study. We'll look at the example. They'll tell us the design, the structure of the study, may be singled out separately or embedded within the other details. It will include the materials, so you'll learn everything that was used, and in studies with adults, this would include any inventories or questionnaires that have been used. And then the procedure, exactly what participants experience when they participate in the study. You might have other sections like statistical procedure, or as I already mentioned, some of these might be collapsed. It definitely should be clear, understandable, and interesting, and this should be sort of a fun part of the paper to read. Most of your critique that you're going to do of research studies will be critiquing the method. So here is our examples from the study that we've been looking at. So here's the method. This is copied right out of the paper, and their participants are healthy, full-term, 5 and 9-month-old infants. 16 9-months-old were assigned to the social condition, and then they tell us 9 boys, mean age of 8 months, 27 days, and the range of those. So it looks like they're dealing with all boys right here, and 16 to the inanimate control condition, and they tell us the ages. 18 5-months-old were assigned to the social condition, still all boys, and 18 to the inanimate control condition, all boys. 3 additional 9-month-olds and 4 additional 5-months-old participated, but were excluded from analyses because of fussiness. So one infant was fussy, they couldn't test him. Procedural error, 3 infants, meaning the researchers themselves made some sort of mistake when they were doing the experiment. Parental interference, 1 infant was excluded because the mom or dad got in the way. Or failing to choose either puppet, 2 infants didn't choose. And then they tell us how they were recruited. Infants were recruited through mailings and follow-up phone calls and were given a token gift for participation. You might be wondering, why did they use all boys? It's not because they don't care about girls or because they think girls are any different. It's that we want to rule out the effects of gender. So we want to make sure that any results that we get aren't a consequence of differences between boys and girls, but are in fact differences in the scenarios. And likely they'll replicate this study using girls since they've only included boys this time. Next, we continue to procedure. So box familiarization is what they're telling us. Infants sat on their parents' laps and were presented with a clear plastic box containing a rattle that would be presented during the puppet show. So they were shown the box. An experimenter held the box in front of the infant, said, "Look," shaking box. "Look," grabbing edge of box. "Look," opening box. And "Ooh," lifting the rattle out of box and shaking it. She then said, "Should we put it in again?" "Look," putting rattle back in box. "Look," closing lid. "It's in there again," shaking box. She then said, "Should we take it out again?" and repeated the familiarization once more. So this is so that the infants have seen this and encountered this particular scenario before. Next, we have habituation events. Infants were taken to a testing room in which they sat on their parents' lap at the end of a black table surrounded on 3 sides by black curtains. So no distractions in this environment. Approximately 165 centimeters from the infant, a black curtain could be raised and lowered to reveal a puppet stage. During habituation trials, 2 puppets, gray and orange cats, sat at the back corners of the stage. The familiar box containing the rattle sat in the center of the stage, equidistant from each puppet. An experimenter performed the puppet show out of sight of the infants by placing her hands through a black curtain at the back of the stage. Parents were instructed to sit quietly with their infants and not to attempt to direct their attention in any way. In the social condition, this is what happened. So they gave us the foundation for everyone. Now they're telling us about the condition. At the start of each trial, the protagonist puppet, which was a dog, entered from the center of the back of the stage and moved to one side of the box. He leaned down to look in the box twice, then jumped on the front corner of the box. He attempted to open the box 4 times. On the first 2 attempts, he pulled up, lifted the edge of the box a few inches, and dropped it back down. On the 3rd and 4th attempt, he lifted the edge of the lid and lowered it while continuously holding onto the lid, as if the lid was too heavy for him to open. On a 5th attempt, the cat puppet on the opposite side of stage from the protagonist, and then they're telling us in parentheses that they alternated sides each trial, intervened. During opening events, the opener puppet moved forward, grabbed the other corner of the box lid, and opened the box together with the protagonist. Once the lid was open, the protagonist dove down into the box, grabbing the rattle. The opener then ran off stage and the protagonist lifted the rattle out of the box. So now we see this is training to let the infant see. During closing events, the closer puppet moved forward. So one of the cats was randomly assigned to be opener, one to be closer. The closer puppet moved forward and jumped on the lid of the box, slamming it shut, and the protagonist dove down next to the box. The closer then ran off stage, and the protagonist sat up. After the protagonist sat up during each trial, holding the rattle during pro-social events, not holding the rattle during anti-social events, all action paused. Both opening and closing events lasted approximately 15 seconds. Looking time was measured from the point at which the action paused until the infants looked away for 2 consecutive seconds, or until 60 seconds had elapsed, whichever came first. So I hope that all makes sense, and I want you to note the level of detail on this. Like exactly the protagonist tries to open the box 4 times, exactly for a few inches, exactly what happens the next time, exactly when the protagonist comes forward, and exactly what the protagonist does, and what the opener does, and what the closer does, and how long this takes, and exactly how they measured the infant's response. Next, in the inanimate control condition. Inanimate control events were identical to social events, except that the protagonist puppet was replaced with an inanimate plastic pincher covered in green duct tape. Notice how specific they are. At the start of each trial, the pincher entered from the center of the back of the stage and moved to one side of the box as the protagonist had done. As when the protagonist had looked inside the box, the pincher moved slightly forward toward the rattle in the box twice, and then grasped the front corner of the box, lifting and dropping the edge twice, then lifting and lowering the edge twice. On the fifth lift, the cat puppet on the opposite side of the box from the pincher moved forward toward the front of the box. During opening events, identical to opening events in the social condition, the opener grabbed the corner of the box and opened the box lid with the pincher. The pincher then reached into the box and grasped the rattle. The opener ran off stage and the pincher lifted the rattle out of the box. During closing events, identical to the closing events in the social condition, the closer jumped on the lid of the box, slamming it shut. The pincher then touched the stage surface next to the box. The closer ran off stage and the pincher lifted up off the stage. Once the pincher lifted, holding the rattle in the opening events, not holding the rattle in closing events, all action paused and the infant's looking time was measured. As in the social condition, both the opening and closing events lasted 15 seconds. To determine exactly what aspects of the display infants were relying on in the social condition, we modified the procedure slightly for the 5-month-old. Specifically, we asked whether infants would still positively evaluate the box opener in a case in which the protagonist did not lift the rattle from the box. Oh no, I think I have missed a line here. And so then they are describing a slightly modified situation. You can see it in the draft paper, but I don't have it in here. So a slightly modified situation. Importantly, for each age group, the final location of the rattle was identical in both the social and inanimate control conditions, and thus cannot account for differences in the results between conditions. Infants in both social and inanimate control conditions were habituated to opening and closing events in alternation. So the criterion for habituation, meaning they're used to it, was either their looking time on 3 consecutive trials was less than half their looking time on the first 3 trials. So they're keeping, how long are they doing this? It depends on the infant's response. And when the infant gets bored with the activity, they stop and then they run the test. So that's what they're describing here, which is why it's important to watch the habituation description in the videos I posted. So now the choice test. How are they doing the choice? Parents were instructed to turn their chairs 90 degrees to the right so they were no longer facing the puppet stage, and to close their eyes. They don't want the parents to influence the infants. An experimenter blind to the identity of the opener and closer, puppets, so the experimenter doesn't know who the opener, whether the gray kitty was the opener or the closer, and the parent can't see. And so now we have double-blind experiment. An experimenter blind to the identity of the opener and closer puppets presented them to the infant, holding one in each hand, initially out of the infant's reach. The infant was required to look at both puppets and then back to the experimenter. So when the infant's eyes did that, once the infant had seen both puppets and the experimenter, the puppets were moved within reach of the infant, and the infant's choice was coded by the blinded experimenter as the first puppet the infant intentionally touched. That is, touched it while concurrently looking at it. See how careful they are. An independent coder, blind to the identity of the puppets. No. Okay, I'm going to apologize for that. I did that because I thought I had inadvertently not been recording this, and this takes such a long time that I didn't want that to happen. So forgive my no, I'm not going to start over and re-record this slide. I've done that too many times in this. So an independent coder blind to the identity of the puppets as well as as well, so this person also didn't know which puppet was which, recoded a randomly chosen 25% of the infant's choices and agreed with the original experimenter on 100% of the cases. So if I could write on the screen with my pen, I would write, this is inter-rater reliability. They had someone else go in and look at these and make sure that the raters were judging the situation accurately. And it says, yes, they had agreed on 100% of the cases. So we had good inter-rater reliability. Now they're talking about counterbalancing. So counterbalancing we haven't met yet, but you'll understand it through here. It just means that we're rotating certain aspects of the experiment so that those aspects don't interfere with the outcomes. The following were counterbalanced across infants within all conditions and in each grade group. The experimental condition, so whether there would be a social or inanimate control. The identity of the opener, so they didn't always make the gray cat the opener and the orange cat the closer. They rotated it, counterbalanced it. The order of opening and closing events during habituation. So are we going to have a helper come out first, or are we going to have an opener come out first or a closer come out first? So they rotated that because they didn't want it to be, oh, actually the infants just preferred whichever one came out first. No, they rotated that. The side of the opener, did the opener come from the left or right? They rotated that. They didn't want it to a criticism to be, oh, infants just like things that come from the right. And the side of the opener, left or right, during choice. So during habituation, they rotated the sides and the choice. So you can see that all of this counterbalancing is done to offset critique about the internal validity of the experiment. They don't want anyone to come up and say, oh, this might not have been the helpfulness of the cat. It might have just been the fact that the cat was on the right, or it might have been just that babies prefer orange cats. So they took care of all of those things through counterbalancing. So this slide shows the primary thing you'll be asked to do as you read through experiment 2 is to parse the study. So first off, let's identify the independent variable. And in this case, I think there are 2 independent variables. First, independent variable 1, we had helpfulness. Condition 1, pro-social puppet, versus condition 2, the antisocial puppet. And then we also had the second independent variable that they introduced in that social condition versus the inanimate object condition. And I've named this variable intentionality. And so they were trying to test whether the intentionality of the protagonist would impact whether or not the infants preferred the helper. And in condition 1, we had a puppet protagonist, or like a character, a social protagonist, versus condition 2, in which we had that mechanical pincher protagonist with no social kind of characteristics. So these are the variables that the researchers thought would impact the choice the infants made. So the dependent variable is the infant preference for prosocial others. And the conceptual definition I got directly from their paper, but I had to go all the way to the discussion to find what I thought was a good conceptual definition. Infants' positive assessment of those who aid others in their goals to reach a particular location or move along a given trajectory, and negative assessment of those who block such goals. I think that's a good conceptual definition based on their own words. It includes like their internal state, their assessment, and it includes behaviors that they're observing through their preference choices. So I think it's a good enough conceptual definition. And then the operational definition, how are they measuring it? They're measuring it through the infant choice of a pro-social puppet who helped a protagonist open a box, or an antisocial puppet who slammed the box shut. And so these are really important concepts. Don't just really work hard on these. Ask questions if you don't really get it. And then what extraneous variables were controlled by the researcher? I don't think I've named all of them, but I think I've named many of them. They controlled the possibility of parent bias or experimenter bias through a double blind, meaning that neither the experimenter nor the well, the parent turned at a 90-degree angle and closed their eyes so they couldn't see what choice the infant was making, and couldn't in any way influence the infant. And likewise, the experimenter didn't know which of the two puppets had been the one that was the helper. So in that case, I think they controlled those pretty well through a double blind. Then they controlled the color and entry direction of the opener-closer puppet through counterbalancing, meaning that sometimes the helper was orange and at opposite times, alternating, the helper puppet was gray. And also likewise, half the time the helper puppet entered from the right and half the time the helper puppet entered from the left. So they took away those possibility of extraneous variables. And I also remembered that they controlled for differences in infant habituation by repeating the procedure until the infant looked away for 2 seconds, at which point that infant was habituated. And so that's how long they repeated the experiment, so that controlled for differences in infant characteristics. So we won't spend so much time on the results because it's going to be a harder section for you, especially since a lot of you haven't had statistics. But even if you've had statistics, it can be a challenge because they use pretty advanced statistics these days. So what it's going to present is the quantitative results of the study. So all the charts, the tables, the data. You'll notice that each table and chart is numbered and has a title, and that the narrative just before the table or chart will talk about it. But it's just going to talk about it in terms of numbers right here. So they're not going to tell you any implications. They're just giving you the numbers. And so it can be really hard. So you can look for statements like significantly higher or significant difference. That word significant is really important because it means that there's only a slim chance that this result could occur by chance. And you could also look for something like p less than 0.05 or p less than 0.01, because that means that the odds of getting such a result by chance have a probability of less than 5% or less than 1%. So these are the things you can look for. So let's take a look in our paper. So here's the results. First off, they tested for habituation. They wanted to see, well, do these babies differ? You know, that we assign them randomly, so they shouldn't be different. And so they were hoping that in terms of how long it took them to habituate, that there wouldn't be differences between the two groups, especially across the inanimate, between the social and the inanimate control condition. And they found that indeed the difference was not significant, and that's what they wanted. So that's good. So they're just telling you our two groups of infants were the same, which is what they want in terms of random assignment. And then this is the result of interest. What did the infants choose? The choice test. So it says here patterns of choice differed significantly. So they want that across the social and inanimate control conditions. And they didn't differ by age. So this was true of all the infants in both age groups. So infants in the social condition, where that puppet protagonist was used, significantly preferred the opener over the closer. 25 of the 34 infants chose the opener, and that was statistically significantly different. And 13 of the 18 5-months-old, they're just telling us that this is similar for the 5-months-old and the 16 and the 9-month-old infants, excuse me. Those in the inanimate control condition, interestingly, slightly preferred the closer, the opener. And here you can see the chart. I can tease this through with you a little bit. 1 star means significantly different. 2 stars mean it's really different. And NS means it's not different. And so what they're telling us is that the difference, there's a big difference in which they choose. So the gray is the opener, the black is the closer. The opener was the pro-social helper guy, helper kitty puppet. And you can see that those 5-months-old in the social condition definitely preferred the opener. And that the opposite was true in the inanimate control condition. They preferred the one who slammed the lid shut, which is sort of interesting. And then they're telling us these two weren't different. Like the extent to which they preferred the opener or closer weren't significantly different. And then likewise, same pattern for the 9-month-olds. And you can see they've named it figure 1 and then described it here. And then they're describing the rest of those results. And then here, this is a little bit unusual in the results section. If I were grading their paper, I would say this next paragraph should be in the discussion section. But they write, the marginal preference for the closer in our inanimate control condition, while significantly different from the preference for the opener in the social condition, is of note. It's possible that in this non-social version of the events, infants found the jumping, slamming behavior of the closer to be perceptually more interesting than the opening behavior of the opener. Indeed, infants' emotional reactions to the closing events across conditions suggest that this is the case. So they include this in the results. Typically, we don't explain any of the numbers until we get to the discussion. You'll probably find that as the dominant model in other papers you read. Although, mind you, I think this is an excellent paper. And then the discussion is the last that we'll go through. So this is just a summary of the results of the study placed into a bigger picture. And they'll summarize it in an easier to understand language. They'll tell you what the implications are, like what's important about it, what changes does it suggest to our way of thinking. And then likely they'll circle back and relate it to the earlier studies they presented in the Lit Review. And they'll tell you the limitations of the study. These are factors that limit the findings, like how much we can rely on the findings. So they'll criticize their own study in this section, basically. It could include things that went wrong in the study or limit its generalizability or just design things that they couldn't control. And they'll indicate future research. Now, we're not going to see all of this in the discussion for the paper that we're reading because I'm only sharing with you the discussion of experiment 1. But all this bigger discussion will take place in experiment 2, so you should look for that. And incidentally, action steps would be here as well. If the researchers think the result is really important, they might suggest changes to policy or practices around their findings. So in our study, remember, this is not a final discussion. This is a midpoint discussion where they're setting us up for experiment 2. And so they wrote, when shown an inanimate object, a puppet, trying but failing to open a box containing a rattle, infants preferred a puppet that helped the agent open the box to one that prevented the agent from opening the box. This replicates previous findings, that infants prefer those who help versus hinder an agent to achieve its location-directed goal, and suggests that infants' social evaluative capacities generalize beyond a single social scenario or goal type. Additionally, the present study's use of an inanimate picture in the control condition allowed us to show infants exactly the same physical actions carried out on the box by all characters involved. Only the social identity of the central character differed, and yet infants' preferences suggested they interpreted the box opening and box closing characters' actions quite differently across conditions. Experiment 2, now they're setting us up for the next experiment. Experiment 2 replicates this finding with a different type of object-directed goal, retrieving a dropped ball. Experiment 2 assessed 5-month-olds using a reaching procedure and 3-month-olds using a preferential looking procedure. Now, as you are going to be analyzing the next experiment, make note of this setup. Here we have 2 different procedures which should suggest to you 2 different operational definitions, even though they're still having the same preference that they're measuring. So be careful when you're writing this up.